The Emergency Management Center in Westbrook had no tolerance for improvisation. Senior Coordinator Maya Chen stood at the back of the operations room, her uniform impeccably pressed and her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her personnel file was flawless, but that same perfectionism had earned her a reputation that followed her like a shadow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, emergency response teams prepared for what meteorologists were calling the storm of the decade. Supervisors shouted over each other, technicians adjusted monitoring equipment, and volunteers handed out assignments with barely contained urgency. Director Thomas Blackwell's voice cut through the chaos as he outlined evacuation zones and emergency protocols. Remember, people, we follow the playbook on this one. No exceptions, no improvisation. The models are clear. Northeastern quadrant gets hit first, followed by central corridors. We evacuate in sequence, starting with Zone A. Maya listened carefully, her tablet already filled with notes and calculations she had made that morning. While others nodded along, her eyes kept returning to the atmospheric pressure readings from the offshore buoys data that told a different story than the official forecasts. When the floor opened for questions, no one turned to Maya. Her reputation preceded her. Senior Coordinator Chen, the human rulebook. The woman who never deviated from protocol, who filed reports in triplicate, who could recite emergency management codes from memory. Someone called her Protocol Chen once, and the nickname had stuck, though never to her face. "Director," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The barometric readings from buoy 27 show unusual patterns that don't match our current models. The storm might shift course toward the southern basin." The room didn't fall silent, but conversations quieted. Director Blackwell glanced up from his tablet, expression unreadable. "The National Weather Service confirmed our projections an hour ago," he replied. "We're working with the best data available. Let's stick to the plan." Maya nodded professionally, though her mind was already running calculations based on the discrepancies she'd identified. She'd seen this pattern before in a case study from Hurricane Laura. Sudden barometric drop followed by wind shear changes that had redirected the storm's path at the last minute. As the briefing concluded, Deputy Director Sarah Winters approached Maya with a sympathetic smile. "The evacuation plan is solid, Chun. You're overthinking again." "I'd rather overthink than underprepare," Maya replied. But her words fell on deaf ears as Sarah had already turned to consult with another team. Maya gathered her materials and headed to her workstation, a desk positioned at the far end of the room, away from the central hub where most coordinators congregated. Her area was meticulously organized, color-coded binders, labeled drawers, and emergency procedures manuals stacked in perfect alignment. While others had family photos or motivational posters, Maya had topographical maps and weather pattern charts. The isolation wasn't accidental. In 3 years at Westbrook Emergency Management, Maya had earned respect for her competence. Not quite acceptance. Her colleagues valued her encyclopedic knowledge of procedures and regulations, but her rigid adherence to protocol made her an outsider in a field where camaraderie was built through shared experiences and occasional rule bending. She pulled up the latest satellite imagery and cross-referenced it with historical data from similar storm systems. The numbers supported her concerns. This storm wasn't behaving according to standard models. But meteorology wasn't an exact science, and she had been wrong before. Perhaps that's why no one took her concerns seriously today. "Hey Chun, you joining us for the coordination briefing?" called Michael Torres, the team lead for emergency transportation. "I'll be there." "In 5 minutes," she replied, eyes still fixed on her screen. "Just finishing some calculations." Torres shook his head as he walked away. "Always with the calculations," he muttered, just loud enough for her to hear. Maya ignored the comment and continued working. She had learned early in her career that her attention to detail was both her greatest strength and what kept her at arm's length from her colleagues. In college, she had been the student who highlighted textbooks in 5 different colors and created emergency response scenarios while others partied. During her internship at FEMA, she had been the one who stayed late reviewing evacuation models while her peers networked at happy hours. At Westbrook, she was the coordinator who memorized every regulation, who insisted on running full simulations when others were satisfied with abbreviated drills, who filled out every field in reports that others left blank. Her methods weren't popular, but they were thorough, and thoroughness saved lives in emergency management. The coordination briefing was held in the tactical room, where large screens displayed weather radar, traffic patterns, and evacuation routes. Maya took a seat at the back, tablet ready for notes. Director Blackwell stood at the front, flanked by team leaders from police, fire, medical, and transportation services. Hurricane Diana has intensified to Category 3 and is moving northwest. At 12 miles per hour, Blackwell announced. Landfall expected at 06:00 tomorrow. We're initiating Phase 1 evacuations for coastal zones immediately, with Phase 2 starting at 1800 hours. The evacuation plan followed Westbrook's standard hurricane protocol: coastal areas first, then low-lying neighborhoods, followed by areas with limited evacuation routes. It was textbook emergency management, the same procedure they had used for the past decade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya raised her hand. Director, if the storm shifts southward as the buoy data suggests, we'd be evacuating in the wrong order. Southern neighborhoods would have less time than we're planning for. Blackwell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Senior Coordinator Chen, the National Hurricane Center, has confirmed our projected path. Unless they issue a formal update, we follow established protocol. But sir, the barometric readings. Thank you for your input, he interrupted, effectively ending the discussion. Let's continue with assignment distributions. The rest of the meeting proceeded without Maya's participation. Assignments were distributed, resources allocated, and timelines established. When her name was called, it was for the most straightforward task: coordinating shelter supplies. Important work, but far from the critical path decision-making she had trained for. As the room emptied, Deputy Director Winters lingered behind. Maya, you need to pick your battles. Questioning the director's plan in front of everyone doesn't help team cohesion. I wasn't questioning his authority, Maya replied. I was raising a legitimate concern based on data. Sarah sighed. Look, everyone knows you're thorough. But emergency management isn't just about following every regulation to the letter. It's about leadership and adaptability too. Adaptability should include being willing to adjust plans when new data emerges, Maya countered. The difference is knowing when data justifies changing course and when it's just statistical noise, Sarah said. That's the judgment call you're still learning to make. The conversation ended there, but the words echoed in Maya's mind as she returned to her workstation. Was she being overly cautious? Was she seeing patterns that weren't meaningful? Or was she the only one noticing a potentially catastrophic blind spot? She pulled up the weather models again, this time overlaying historical data from similar hurricanes that had affected the region. The pattern was clear to her: the unusual pressure drops followed by wind shear. Changes had preceded course alterations in 3 out of 4 comparable storms. If Hurricane Diana followed the same pattern, the southern basin of Westbrook, home to over 100,000 residents, the city's water treatment plant, and the regional hospital, would take a direct hit with minimal evacuation time. The standard protocols weren't designed for this scenario. They assumed a northeastern approach, with the storm weakening as it moved inland. But if Diana shifted south, it would maintain strength longer, funneled by the coastal geography into the most vulnerable part of the city. Maya compiled her findings into a detailed report, complete with data visualizations and historical comparisons. She attached evacuation simulations showing the time required to move southern residents to safety. The numbers were concerning. Under current plans, they would need at least 8 hours to evacuate the southern quadrant, but if the storm shifted, they might have less than 5. She sent the report to Director Blackwell with a respectful note requesting reconsideration of the evacuation sequence. His response came 20 minutes later. Report received. Continue with assigned duties. Will review when time permits. Maya checked the timestamp 3:42 p.m. The evacuation of coastal zones was already underway. If they waited much longer to adjust the sequence, the southern evacuation routes would become congested with coastal evacuees heading to inland shelters. The window for an orderly evacuation of the southern basin was closing rapidly. She tried calling the director's office but was told he was in meetings with city officials. She sent messages to Deputy Director Winters and the chief meteorologist, but received no immediate response. Everyone was focused on executing the established plan, a plan that Maya increasingly believed was dangerously flawed. At her desk, Maya stared at the emergency management handbook she had practically memorized. Section 7. 3 outlined the chain of command during crisis operations. Section 12. 8 detailed procedures for updating evacuation plans mid-execution. Section 23. 4 covered the circumstances under which a senior coordinator could escalate concerns if standard channels were unresponsive. All her career, Maya had followed these procedures to the letter. She had built her reputation on being the most reliable, most consistent, most rule-abiding coordinator in the department. She had never taken shortcuts, never improvised when a regulation existed, never challenged authority without exhausting proper channels first. But as she watched the latest radar images, showing the first hints of the storm's southward turn exactly as she had predicted, Maya realized that following protocol might lead to disaster. The handbook didn't have a section for what to do when following the rules could cost lives. Outside her window, the sky darkened as the outer bands of Hurricane Diana approached. Emergency vehicles moved through the streets, their lights reflecting off buildings as they assisted with the coastal evacuation. On her screen, traffic cameras showed the main highways already congesting with evacuees. And in the southern basin, families were continuing normal activities, unaware that they might soon be in the storm's direct path. Maya faced the most difficult decision of her career: continue following orders and protocol, or take action based on her analysis, risking her job and reputation in the process. The choice would define not just her professional future, but potentially the lives of thousands of Westbrook residents. She took a deep breath and pulled up the emergency broadcast system interface. Protocol dictated that all evacuation notices had to be approved by the director or deputy director before transmission. Overriding that protocol was grounds for immediate termination and possible legal consequences. Maya's hands hovered over the keyboard. 20 years of following rules, of doing things by the book, of being Protocol Chun, weighed against her certainty that the southern basin needed to evacuate now, not hours from now when it would be too late. In that moment, Maya realized that her reputation for rigid rule following had never been about the rules themselves. It had been about ensuring people's safety. And sometimes, ensuring safety meant knowing when the rules no longer served their purpose. She began typing the emergency alert for the southern basin, her fingers steady despite the gravity of her decision. The message was clear, concise, and urgent: immediate evacuation, route designations, shelter locations. She included her credentials and took full responsibility for the override. Before submitting, she tried one last time to reach Director Blackwell. His assistant answered, sounding harried. "He's in an emergency teleconference with the governor. the assistant said. I can't interrupt. This can't wait, Maya insisted. The storm is shifting south. We need to evacuate the southern basin immediately. I'll pass along the message when he's available, the assistant replied, clearly skeptical. But you know the chain of command, Chun. Maya did know the chain of command. She had followed it faithfully for her entire career. But as she hung up the phone and looked at the emergency alert waiting to be sent, she knew that today, following that chain would cost too much. She pressed send. The alert went out to every phone, television, and radio in the southern basin. The automated system also notified emergency personnel to redirect resources southward. And it flagged her name as the authorizing officer, a detail that ensured everyone would know exactly who had broken protocol. Within minutes, her phone rang. It was Deputy Director Winters, her voice tight with controlled anger. Chun, did you just issue an evacuation order for the southern basin without authorization? Yes, Maya replied, her voice steady. The storm is shifting south. We don't have time to wait for approvals. You've exceeded your authority. This is going to cause panic and disrupt our entire operation. Report to the director's office immediately. But Maya didn't move. Instead, she pulled up the latest radar imagery, which showed Hurricane Diana's eye making the southward turn she had predicted. She sent the image to every coordinator in the department with a simple message. This is why I sent the alert. Southern Basin needs to evacuate now. Her desk phone rang again. This time it was Director Blackwell himself. Chun, what the hell do you think you're doing? Saving lives, sir, she replied. The storm has shifted. The southern basin is going to take a direct hit in less than 6 hours. We need all resources diverted there immediately. You don't make that call, Blackwell said, his voice dangerously. Quiet. I do. And you've just thrown our entire evacuation plan into chaos. The plan was based on a projected path that's no longer accurate, Maya insisted. Sir, please look at the latest radar. The National Hurricane Center just issued an update confirming the southward shift. There was a pause, and Maya could hear typing in the background. Then Blackwell swore under his breath. Stay where you are, he ordered. Don't take any further action. I'll deal with this situation and with your insubordination after I've assessed the new information. The line went dead, and Maya sat back in her chair, suddenly aware of the enormity of what she had done. In a single action, she had violated core protocols, undermined the chain of command, and potentially ended her career in emergency management. But as she watched the traffic cameras in the southern basin, showing families beginning to pack their cars and evacuation buses starting to arrive, she knew she had made the right choice. Whether or not she had a job tomorrow, those people would have the time they needed to reach safety. Her computer pinged with a department-wide message from Director Blackwell. Attention all personnel. Emergency operations plan has been updated to prioritize southern basin evacuation. All coordinators report to Central Command for reassignment. This is not a drill, no acknowledgement of Maya's action, no vindication of her concerns. Just a businesslike update that effectively validated her decision while maintaining the appearance that it came through proper channels. Maya gathered her tablet and emergency protocols binder and headed to Central Command. Whatever consequences awaited her, she would face them knowing she had done what was necessary. For the first time in her career, Maya Chen had broken the rules, and it might make all the difference. The Central Command room had transformed into organized chaos. Coordinators rushed between stations, updating evacuation routes and reallocating resources. Police captains conferred with transportation officials about traffic management. Shelter coordinators scrambled to prepare additional facilities for the redirected evacuees. Maya entered quietly, expecting hostility or at least awkward silence. Instead, she found herself immediately pulled into the operations by Michael Torres. "Chun, we need your southern basin evacuation scenarios," he said without preamble. "Which routes did your simulations show as most efficient?" Before she could answer, another coordinator called for her attention. "Chun, what's the capacity at Memorial Hospital? Can they evacuate patients or do they shelter in place?" The questions continued, rapid fire and urgent. No one mentioned her unauthorized alert or breach of protocol. They simply needed her expertise, now that her assessment of the situation had been proven correct. Maya moved through the room with a new sense of purpose, providing the information she had meticulously gathered and analyzed. Her years of thorough preparation, her attention to details others overlooked, her insistence on understanding every variable, all of it, now served the emergency response in ways she had always believed it could. As the night progressed and Hurricane Diana continued its ominous approach toward Westbrook's southern basin, Maya found herself at the center of the evacuation effort she had initiated. The coordinator who had always stood at the margins was now essential to the operation's success. Director Blackwell appeared occasionally, issuing orders and consulting with team leaders. He nodded to Maya once, a brief, almost imperceptible acknowledgement before continuing his rounds. Whether it was approval or merely recognition, Maya couldn't tell. But in that moment, with lives at stake and a city in motion, professional validation seemed remarkably unimportant. What mattered was that the people of Westbrook's southern basin were heading to safety, hours before a catastrophic storm would change their city forever. And Maya Chen, who had spent her career following every rule without exception, had finally learned when breaking those rules was not just acceptable but necessary. The storm was coming, and everything would change, including the woman who had once been known only for following orders. The first signs of Hurricane Diana's impact reached Westbrook as darkness fell. Rain lashed against the emergency management center windows, and wind gusts bent trees at alarming angles. Inside Central Command, Maya monitored evacuation progress through a grid of live feeds showing traffic cameras, shelter check-ins, and emergency response deployments. The Southern Basin evacuation was proceeding with remarkable efficiency given the last-minute implementation. Digital counters showed over 60% of residents already relocated to safety, with the remainder actively in transit or preparing to leave. Every available bus, ambulance, and police vehicle had been redirected to assist, creating a massive logistical operation that stretched the city's resources to their limits. "Coordinator Chun," called Director Blackwell from across the room. "My office now." Maya logged out of her workstation and followed him through the bustling command center. Conversation quieted as she passed, colleagues watching with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity. Everyone knew she had bypassed chain of command, and everyone was waiting to see the consequences. Blackwell's office was spartanly furnished. A desk, 3 chairs, and walls covered with emergency management certificates, commendations, and procedural flowcharts. He closed the door behind them and gestured for Maya to sit. "In 23 years of emergency management," he began, his voice controlled and even, "I have never had a coordinator directly countermand my orders." Maya sat perfectly straight, hands folded in her lap. "I understand, sir. Do you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you decided your assessment outweighed the National Hurricane Center, the city's emergency protocols, and direct orders from your superiors." "The data supported immediate action," Maya replied. "I tried to follow proper channels, but there wasn't time." Blackwell leaned forward. "You're right." The words hung in the air between them. Maya, who had prepared a detailed defense of her actions, found herself momentarily speechless. "You're right about the storm path," Blackwell continued. "You're right that waiting would have cost lives. But that doesn't change the fact that you violated core protocols and undermined the chain of command." He stood and walked to the window. "Watching the intensifying storm, I've reviewed your report. Your analysis was sound, better than what we got from the National Hurricane Center. But this department can't function if coordinators issue evacuation orders whenever they disagree with official directives. I understand, sir, Maya said quietly. I accept whatever disciplinary action you deem appropriate. Blackwell turned to face her. That's the problem, Chun. You followed the rules so perfectly for so long that when you finally broke one, you broke it spectacularly. A hint of grudging respect colored his voice. Most people would be trying to justify themselves or downplay their actions. You're sitting there prepared to accept termination because you believed you were saving lives. I still believe that, sir. So do I, Blackwell sighed. Which puts me in a difficult position. I can't condone insubordination, but I also can't ignore that your actions may have prevented a catastrophe. Before he could continue, Deputy Director Winters burst into the office without knocking. Tom, we've got problems. The hospital's backup generators are failing, and we've got 300 patients who can't be evacuated in time. Blackwell was immediately alert. Options? We're looking at emergency airlifts for critical cases, but most will have to shelter in place. The building is rated for Category 4 winds, but with the storm strengthening. Get me structural assessments and patient counts by floor, Blackwell ordered. And find out if we can get National Guard helicopters in before the winds make air operations impossible. As Winters rushed out, Blackwell turned back to Maya. Your disciplinary hearing will have to wait. Right now, I need every coordinator focused on response operations. Report to Torres for assignment. Maya nodded and stood to leave. And Chun, Blackwell added, that hospital is in the southern basin. If you hadn't issued that alert when you did, we'd be trying to evacuate thousands of additional residents while dealing with this situation. Remember that when you're updating your resume. The comment hovered somewhere between rebuke and acknowledgement. Maya took it as both and returned to the command center, where Michael Torres was coordinating transportation resources. Shun, perfect timing, Torres called. I need someone to take point on the hospital situation. You're the most familiar with Southern Basin infrastructure. Maya hesitated. The director just pulled me from disciplinary review for emergency assignment. Are you sure you want me handling something this critical? Torres looked at her with newfound respect. Shun, you're the one who saw this coming when nobody else did. Right now, I don't care about protocols. I care about who can get the job done. The vote of confidence was unexpected, especially from Torres, who had always been among the most dismissive of her by-the-book approach. But crisis had a way of clarifying priorities, stripping away office politics and personal differences until only competence mattered. Maya took charge of the hospital response team, quickly assembling a group of coordinators and technical specialists. They set up in a small conference room adjacent to the main command center, walls soon covered with hospital schematics, patient inventories, and resource allocation charts. First priority is power, Maya directed. The backup generators are failing, and we have patients on life support. Let's get mobile generators deployed immediately. A young coordinator named Jason raised his hand. Standard protocol requires director approval for deploying the emergency power reserve. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Maya, the rule follower, who had broken the biggest rule of all just hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on her. We don't have time for approval chains, she replied without hesitation. Deploy the generators and document the deviation. I'll take responsibility. Jason nodded and hurried out to coordinate the deployment. The rest of the team looked at Maya with new understanding. Protocol Chun was gone, replaced by someone who recognized when rules served their purpose and when they became obstacles. The hospital situation deteriorated rapidly as Hurricane Diana's full force approached the southern basin. Wind gusts exceeding 110 miles per hour made ground transportation increasingly dangerous. The backup generators failed completely, leaving the facility running on emergency battery systems with limited capacity. We've got maybe 2 hours of power for critical systems, reported Dr. Eliza Hammond, the hospital's administrator, via emergency radio. After that, we're looking at manual ventilation for 37 patients and no monitoring capability for another 60 in critical care. Maya studied the structural assessment that had just arrived. While the main hospital building was constructed to withstand hurricane-force winds, the eastern wing, which housed the intensive care unit, showed potential vulnerabilities around the roofline and upper floor windows. Dr. Hammond, you need to relocate patients from the eastern wing immediately, Maya directed. Move them to interior corridors on lower floors. That's against hospital emergency protocols, Hammond objected. Moving critical patients without proper equipment. The eastern wing may not survive these winds, Maya interrupted. Sometimes you have to break protocol to save lives. There was a pause on the radio then. Understood. Beginning relocation now. Maya turned to her team. I need options for getting additional power to that hospital within the next 90 minutes. The solutions came rapidly. National Guard had mobile generators, but couldn't transport them safely through the storm. Nearby buildings had emergency systems that could be reconfigured, but the connections would require specialized equipment. 3 facilities within a mile radius had industrial generators, but accessing them meant sending teams into increasingly dangerous conditions. None of the options followed standard emergency protocols. All involved significant risks. And all required immediate decisions without time for proper approval channels. 6 months ago, Maya would have been paralyzed by the deviations from procedure. Now she evaluated each option based on a single criterion. What would save the most lives? We'll take a 2-pronged approach, she decided. Team 1 will work with building maintenance to reconfigure power sharing from the medical office building. Team 2 will deploy with engineering to retrieve the generator from the Richardson manufacturing facility. It's the closest and most powerful option. The Richardson facility is in the flood zone, one coordinator pointed out. Road access might already be compromised. That's why you'll take the maintenance tunnels, Maya replied, pulling up infrastructure schematics on her tablet. The city's utility tunnels connect the main service corridor to a junction box 200 yards from Richardson. It's not protocol, but it's our best shot. The plans came together with remarkable speed. Teams deployed into the heart of the storm, navigating flooded streets and wind-battered buildings to execute Maya's unorthodox strategy. The command center tracked their progress, tension mounting as the hospital's emergency power reserves dwindled. Team 2 has reached Richardson, reported a breathless voice over the radio. Generator secured. Beginning transport through service tunnels. Team 1 has established connection points at the medical building, came another update. Ready to reconfigure on your command. Maya watched the storm radar, calculating time against power reserves. Execute power transfer. And get me a direct line to Dr. Hammond. The hospital administrator's voice came through, strained but composed. Hammond here. Doctor, we have power solutions inbound, but I need you to prepare for a brief complete outage during the transfer. Your most critical patients, already on manual backup systems, Hammond interrupted. We've broken out every battery-powered device in the building and stationed staff with manual resuscitation equipment. Not by the book, but it'll keep people alive. Maya smiled despite the gravity of the situation. It seemed she wasn't the only one learning when to set aside protocols. The power transfer succeeded with only a 7-minute total outage, a miracle of improvisation and technical skill from teams operating under the most extreme conditions. As the hospital systems came back online, cheers erupted in the command center, but the celebration was short-lived. We've got structural warnings on the eastern wing, called a monitoring technician. Wind speeds exceeding design tolerances. Potential roof compromise imminent. Maya rushed to the station, studying the sensor readings with growing alarm. Despite their precautions, The eastern wing was failing under Diana's onslaught. The relocated. Patients were safer in the interior corridors, but if the roof collapsed, cascading structural failures could threaten the entire facility. She keyed her radio. "Dr. Hammond, eastern wing integrity is failing. Implement full evacuation protocols for that section immediately. Move everyone to the western side of the complex." "Already in progress," Hammond replied, the sound of shouting. And equipment movement audible in the background. "But we've got water coming in through the upper floors. Need structural support teams if available." Maya turned to Torres, who had been monitoring the situation. "We need emergency structural reinforcement at Memorial. Any teams available?" Torres shook his head. "All emergency construction units are dealing with the dam spillway failure on the north side. Nothing to spare." Maya thought quickly, mentally reviewing the southern basin infrastructure and available resources. Standard protocol dictated clear priorities: life safety first, then critical infrastructure, then property conservation. But the hospital represented all three simultaneously. "What about the construction battalion from Fort Marshall?" she suggested. "They have heavy equipment and structural expertise." "Military deployment requires governor approval through proper channels," Torres reminded her. "The request would take hours to process, even with emergency authorization." Maya looked him directly in the eyes. "Then we bypass channels. Call Colonel Ramirez directly. Tell him I'm authorizing an emergency deployment under Section 29 of the Regional Disaster Compact." Torres raised an eyebrow. "Section 29 requires director-level authorization." "Then forge my signature if you have to," Maya replied without hesitation. "That hospital can't wait for paperwork." Torres studied her for a moment, then nodded. With newfound respect. "I never thought I'd see the day when Protocol Chun told me to forge documents." He picked up the secure line to Fort Marshall. "But I like this version of you better." The military engineers arrived within 40 minutes, deployed through flooded streets in amphibious vehicles that civilian emergency services couldn't match. They brought structural bracing equipment, water pumps, and emergency construction. Materials that immediately stabilized the hospital's compromised sections. As reports of their successful intervention reached the command center, Director Blackwell appeared at Maya's station. "You deployed military assets without authorization," he said, his tone unreadable. Maya met his gaze steadily. "Yes, sir. The hospital couldn't wait for proper channels. That's the second major protocol violation in less than 12 hours. He paused, then added, "The governor just called to commend our innovative crisis management and cross-agency coordination." Apparently, Colonel Ramirez was quite impressed with our emergency response integration. Maya said nothing, waiting for the reprimand she knew must follow. Instead, Blackwell handed her a laminated emergency authorization card, the kind only he and Deputy Director Winters carried. "For the remainder of this emergency," he said quietly, "you have Level 1 authorization. Do what needs to be done, Chen. Break whatever rules you have to, just keep people alive." The card felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Level 1 authorization was reserved for the highest emergency management positions, a recognition that sometimes crisis required decisions that couldn't wait for approval chains. "Sir, I don't understand. This morning you were ready to terminate me for insubordination." "This morning I thought I knew what kind of coordinator you were," Blackwell replied. "I was wrong. You're not just a rule follower, Chun. You're someone who understands why the rules exist in the first place, to protect people. And you had the courage to break those rules when they no longer served that purpose." He glanced around the command center, where dozens of emergency personnel worked frantically to respond to Hurricane Diana's growing impact. "That's the kind of judgment I need right now, not blind obedience to protocols that weren't designed for what we're facing." Before Maya could respond, alarms blared from multiple stations. The hurricane had strengthened to Category 4, with wind speeds exceeding 140 miles per hour at the eyewall. The southern basin was taking a direct hit, just as Maya had predicted. "We're not out of this yet," Blackwell said grimly. "The worst is still coming. Use your judgment, Coordinator. Save this city." As he strode away to address other crises, Maya looked down at the authorization card in her hand. All her life, she had sought validation through perfect adherence to rules and procedures. She had built her identity around being the most reliable, most consistent, most protocol observant. Coordinator in emergency management. Now, in the middle of the worst disaster Westbrook had ever faced, she had found a different kind of validation, not for following rules, but for knowing when to break them. The next 12 hours would test that new understanding to its limits. As Hurricane Diana unleashed its full fury on the city she had sworn to protect, Maya returned to the hospital coordination team with renewed purpose. The Level 1 authorization card changed everything, not because it gave her permission to break rules, but because it recognized that she had the judgment to know which rules mattered and which did not. As the eye of Hurricane Diana passed directly over Westbrook's southern basin, bringing a deceptive calm before the second assault, Maya gathered her team for a critical briefing. "We have approximately 40 minutes before the backside of the eye wall hits," she explained, pointing to radar images on the main screen. "This is our window to implement emergency repairs and relocations that would be impossible under full storm conditions." She turned to the assembled coordinators, many of whom had witnessed her transformation from rule follower to rule breaker over the past 12 hours. "I'm authorizing all team leaders to use independent judgment during this window. Standard protocols are suspended where they impede life-saving operations. Document your decisions for the record, but act without waiting for approval chains." The coordinators exchanged glances, some uncertain, others resolute. This was a fundamental shift in how emergency operations had always been conducted in Westbrook. But as they looked at the destruction already visible on monitoring feeds, collapsed buildings, flooded neighborhoods, infrastructure failures throughout the southern basin, they understood that conventional approaches would not be sufficient. "This isn't about abandoning procedures," Maya clarified, seeing their hesitation. "It's about remembering why those procedures exist in the first place, to save lives and protect our community. When following a procedure would endanger that mission, your judgment trumps the rulebook." The teams deployed into the eye of the hurricane, using the brief calm to execute critical operations that would have been impossible under storm conditions. Hospital patients were consolidated into the most secure sections of the building. Emergency repairs were made to power infrastructure. Stranded residents were located and moved to sturdier shelters before the second half of the storm arrived. Maya coordinated from the command center, authorizing unorthodox solutions and resource allocations that bypassed normal constraints. When the water utility reported imminent failure of the main treatment plant, she approved an emergency reconfiguration that violated regulatory standards but would maintain basic water service. When flooding threatened to cut off access to the southern emergency shelter, she authorized breaking through private property walls to create an emergency evacuation corridor. Each decision required weighing immediate needs against established procedures, potential consequences against certain disasters. It was emergency management stripped to its essential purpose, protecting people by any means necessary. As the back wall of the hurricane slammed into Westbrook with even greater fury than the first assault, Maya watched the emergency teams she had empowered responding with unprecedented effectiveness. They weren't waiting for permission or following procedural flowcharts. They were adapting to rapidly changing conditions, making judgment calls based on their expertise, and saving lives that might have been lost in the bureaucratic delays of standard protocols. "You've created a monster, you know, Deputy Director," Winters commented, appearing beside Maya's station. "Once you teach people to question protocols, they never go back to blind obedience. Is that a bad thing?" Maya asked, not looking away from the monitoring screens. That depends on who's doing the questioning, Winters replied. When it's someone like you, someone who understands the purpose behind the rules before breaking them, it works. But not everyone has your judgment. Maya considered this. Maybe that's because we've trained them to follow procedures without understanding why those procedures exist. We've created coordinators who know every regulation but don't know when. Those regulations help and when they harm. And how do we fix that? Winters asked, genuinely curious. By changing how we evaluate success, Maya said, the idea crystallizing as she spoke. Not by how perfectly someone follows protocol, but by how effectively they achieve the purpose behind those protocols. The conversation was interrupted by an urgent call from the dam management team. The city's main reservoir was approaching critical pressure levels as Hurricane Diana dumped unprecedented rainfall into the watershed. Standard procedures called for a controlled release through the spillway, but the calculations showed that even this would likely flood downstream neighborhoods that hadn't been evacuated. We need an alternative release strategy immediately, reported the lead engineer. Conventional options will overflow evacuation routes for sectors 7 through 9. Maya studied the reservoir schematics, looking for options that wouldn't appear in any procedural manual. What about the maintenance tunnels on the eastern embankment? Could we divert flow through those into the abandoned quarry? Those tunnels aren't rated for high-volume water transfer, the engineer objected. And the quarry isn't an approved discharge zone. Environmentally, we'd be looking at serious violations. And if the dam fails completely? Maya asked. The engineer's voice was grim. Catastrophic flooding throughout the southern basin. Thousands of lives at risk. Then we use the tunnels, Maya decided. Begin emergency modifications immediately. I'll take responsibility for the environmental waivers. As the dam team rushed to implement her unorthodox solution, Maya turned to find Director Blackwell watching from nearby. The quarry discharge will contaminate groundwater, he noted. EPA will have our heads. We can clean water later, Maya replied. We can't bring back the dead. Blackwell nodded slowly. 6 months ago, you would have spent hours looking for a solution that followed every regulation. 6 months ago. I thought following rules was the same as doing the right thing, Maya said. I've learned they're not always the same. As Hurricane Diana continued its assault on Westbrook through the night, Maya's transformed approach to emergency management spread throughout the response teams. Coordinators who had once waited for explicit authorization now acted on their own initiative. Procedures were treated as guidelines rather than commandments. The focus shifted from following the right process to achieving the right outcome. By dawn, as the hurricane finally began to weaken and move inland, the emerging assessment showed the results of this philosophical shift. Despite taking the direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane, Westbrook's southern basin had suffered no fatalities. During the storm, property damage was extensive, infrastructure compromised, and recovery would take months, but the people were alive. The first light of dawn revealed Hurricane Diana's devastating impact on Westbrook. The Emergency Management Center's observation deck offered a panoramic view of the southern basin, where entire blocks lay submerged under murky floodwater. Rooftops peaked above the waterline like small islands. Massive trees had been uprooted and tossed across roads like discarded toys. Power lines dangled precariously, and debris floated through what had once been busy streets. Maya stood at the window, clipboard in hand, methodically documenting the damaged sectors. Her uniform was wrinkled from 24 hours of continuous wear, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But her focus remained sharp as she assessed the enormous challenge ahead. Initial damage assessment indicates catastrophic infrastructure impact, she dictated into her recorder. Primary power grid disabled throughout southern quadrants. Water treatment facility compromised but functional at 30% capacity. Hospital, operating on emergency systems only. All major roadways in southern basin impassable due to flooding. Behind her, the command center had transitioned from emergency response to recovery operations. The frantic energy of the storm had been replaced by the steady determination of aftermath management. Coordinators who had worked through the night were being relieved by fresh teams. Emergency resource requests were being processed, and damage reports continued to flow in from across the city. Director Blackwell appeared at her side, his own exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. "You should get some rest, Chen. You've been on duty for over 30 hours straight." Maya glanced up from her clipboard. "With respect, sir, I'll rest when we've established functional recovery operations." Blackwell didn't argue. Instead, he gazed out at the devastated city. The governor's office just released the preliminary impact assessment. 0 storm-related fatalities in Westbrook. Property damage in the billions, but not a single life lost. The significance of those numbers hung between them. In a Category 4 hurricane that had directly struck a major urban area, the absence of fatalities wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. "Your call on the southern basin evacuation made that possible," Blackwell continued. "If we'd stuck to the original plan, we'd be counting bodies instead of buildings." Maya remained silent, uncomfortable with personal recognition when thousands of people had just lost their homes and livelihoods. Her decision had saved lives, but the city was still facing a recovery operation of staggering proportions. "I've been in emergency management for 23 years, Blackwell said, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "I've seen coordinators who follow every rule perfectly and still lose lives. And I've seen cowboys who break every protocol and somehow pull off miracles. But I've never seen anyone navigate that middle ground the way you did last night, knowing exactly which rules mattered and which ones didn't." Maya finally looked up from her clipboard. "I just did what the situation required, sir." "That's exactly my point, Chun. Most people in our field either become rigid rule followers or they reject the system entirely. You found something better understanding the purpose behind the protocols well enough to know when they serve that purpose and when they don't." Before Maya could respond, Deputy Director Winters approached with urgent news. "We've got problems at the emergency shelters," she reported. "Supplies are running critically low, and the main relief convoy is stuck 50 miles out due to road closures. Standard procedure would be to wait for National Guard airdrops, but that could take 12 to 24 hours to organize." Maya and Blackwell exchanged glances. This was exactly the kind of situation where following protocol could lead to unnecessary suffering. "What are our alternatives?" Maya asked. "There's a private helicopter charter company at the regional airport," Winters replied. "They have 6 aircraft that could transport supplies immediately. But emergency requisitioning of private assets requires governor's authorization through proper channels." Maya finished, "which could take hours we don't have." She pulled out her Level 1 authorization card, studying it for a moment. The temporary emergency powers it granted were meant for crisis response during the hurricane itself, not recovery operations. Using it now would be stretching its intended purpose. But people in the shelters needed food, water, and medical supplies now, not after paperwork cleared proper channels. Maya made her decision. Contact the charter company directly. Tell them we're authorizing emergency requisition under the Disaster Response Act. Section 42 will handle the paperwork and payment authorization retroactively. Winters nodded and hurried off to implement the plan. Blackwell watched her go, then turned back to Maya. Section 42 typically requires documented attempts through standard channels first, he noted, though his tone held no criticism. People don't eat paperwork, sir, Maya replied simply. A hint of a smile crossed Blackwell's tired face. No, they don't. He checked his watch. The Emergency Management Committee is meeting in 30 minutes to establish recovery priorities. As acting Operations Chief, you should be there. Maya blinked in surprise. Acting Operations Chief? Did I forget to mention that? Must be the sleep deprivation. Blackwell handed her an official designation letter. Effective immediately. The committee needs someone who can think beyond the standard playbook. The Emergency Management Committee. Meeting took place in City Hall's West Wing, one of the few government buildings that had weathered the hurricane with minimal damage. Around a massive oak table sat the power brokers who would shape Westbrook's recovery. The mayor, city council, representatives, utility executives, FEMA coordinators, and the heads of various emergency response agencies. Maya entered the room quietly, taking an empty seat near the back. She felt conspicuously out of place among these senior officials in her rumpled uniform and with her makeshift clipboard of notes. But as operations chief, even an acting one, her presence was required. Mayor Gloria Ramirez opened the meeting with a grim assessment. Westbrook faces the greatest challenge in our city's history. Early estimates suggest rebuilding will cost upwards of $3 billion and take years to complete. Our immediate priorities must be restoring essential services and providing for displaced residents. The discussion quickly turned to established recovery protocols, the predetermined sequence for restoring infrastructure, the standard timelines for emergency housing, the approved methods for debris removal and damage assessment. Each step followed regulations that had been developed over decades of disaster management experience. Maya listened carefully, noting how the conversation automatically defaulted to standard procedures without consideration of Westbrook's unique circumstances. The southern basin's geography, the scale of infrastructure damage, the approaching hurricane season that could bring additional storms. None of these factors were being incorporated into the recovery planning. With the main power substation destroyed, we're looking at 4 to 6 weeks minimum to restore electricity to the southern basin, explained the utility director. Standard procedure is to prioritize critical infrastructure first, then commercial zones, then residential areas last. The FEMA coordinator nodded. That aligns with federal recovery guidelines. We can begin processing emergency housing assistance for displaced residents in the meantime. Maya studied the infrastructure map spread across the table. The standard approach would leave thousands of families without power for over a month while restaurants and shopping centers were reconnected. It made sense on paper. Restoring economic activity was crucial for long-term recovery, but it ignored the immediate human cost. She thought of the elderly residents she'd helped evacuate, the families with young children, the community that had already endured so much. Protocol dictated they would be last in line for normalcy. "Excuse me," Maya said, speaking up for the first time. The conversation halted as all eyes turned to her. "I'd like to propose an alternative restoration strategy." Mayor Ramirez looked surprised but nodded. "Go ahead, Ms. Chen." Maya Chen, Acting Operations Chief for Emergency Management. She stood and approached the table. "The standard sequential restoration plan will maximize infrastructure efficiency, but at significant human cost. I propose a modified grid-by-grid approach instead." She pointed to the southern basin map. "Instead of restoring service types across the entire area, we focus on complete restoration of smaller grid sections, getting all services back online in targeted neighborhoods before moving to the next. This would allow residents to return to their homes much sooner, even if only in certain areas." The utility director frowned. "That's highly inefficient from an engineering perspective. We'd be constantly shifting crews and equipment instead of completing system-wide repairs. It's also not how federal recovery funds are typically allocated," added the FEMA coordinator. "The guidelines specifically recommend infrastructure-type prioritization." Maya had anticipated these objections. "I've run the numbers," she said, sliding forward a folder of calculations she'd prepared during the night. The modified approach would restore normal living conditions for approximately 40% of displaced residents within 2 weeks, rather than making everyone wait 6 weeks for basic services. She turned to the FEMA coordinator. As for federal guidelines, they explicitly allow for alternative approaches when they better serve the community's needs. Section 7.3 of the Recovery Framework states that local conditions may necessitate adaptation of standard procedures where such adaptation better serves the affected population. The room fell silent as committee members exchanged glances. Maya had just quoted federal regulations that most of them had never read completely, using the rulebook itself to justify breaking from standard procedure. Mayor Ramirez studied Maya with newfound interest. "You're proposing we prioritize getting people home over economic recovery?" "I'm proposing we recognize that economic recovery depends on community stability," Maya clarified. "People who are living in emergency shelters or temporary housing aren't rebuilding businesses or returning to jobs. By creating habitable zones, quickly, we accelerate the human recovery that drives everything else." The mayor turned to Director Blackwell. "Your coordinator makes a compelling case. What's your assessment?" Blackwell didn't hesitate. "Ms. Chun's judgment has already saved countless lives during this disaster. If she says this approach is viable, I'm inclined to support it." For the next hour, Maya walked the committee through her alternative recovery strategy, answering questions and addressing concerns with the same meticulous attention to detail that had once made her the perfect rule follower. But now, that same methodical approach was being applied to reinventing the rules themselves. By meeting's end, the committee had approved her grid-by-grid restoration plan, along with several other modifications to standard recovery protocols. As people gathered their materials to leave, Mayor Ramirez approached Maya. "That was impressive work, Ms. Chun. Where did you develop this approach?" "Last night, ma'am," Maya admitted. "After seeing the initial damage assessments, I realized the standard procedures wouldn't adequately address our specific situation." The mayor raised an eyebrow. "You created an entire alternative recovery strategy overnight, complete with implementation timelines and resource allocations?" "I couldn't sleep anyway," Maya said with a small shrug. "And I knew people would need better options than what the standard playbook offered." Mayor Ramirez studied her for a moment longer. "Director Blackwell mentioned that you were responsible for the Southern Division evacuation decision, the one that saved thousands of lives. It was a team effort, ma'am." "That's not what I heard." The mayor handed Maya her business card. "When this immediate crisis phase ends, come see me. The city needs problem solvers who understand both rules and people." As Maya left City Hall, the scope of the recovery operation was coming into sharp focus. Emergency crews worked to clear major roadways. Helicopters transported critical supplies to isolated neighborhoods. Damage assessment teams documented block after block of destruction. Yet amid the devastation, Maya noticed something remarkable. Residents who had begun returning to check on their properties weren't waiting for official recovery operations. Neighbors helped neighbors clear debris from yards. Community volunteers distributed bottled water from pickup trucks. Local restaurants with generator power offered free meals to anyone in need. The people of Westbrook were creating their own recovery protocols, based not on regulations or guidelines, but on immediate human needs and available resources. They weren't waiting for permission or official direction. They were simply doing what the situation required. Maya stopped too. Help an elderly couple carrying supplies to their damaged home. As she lifted a heavy box of bottled water, the woman smiled gratefully. "You're with emergency management, aren't you?" she asked, nodding toward Maya's uniform. "Yes, ma'am." "Is there something specific you need assistance with?" The woman shook her head. "No, dear. I just wanted to thank you. That evacuation order came just in time. Our neighbor was planning to ride out the storm, but that emergency alert convinced him to leave. His house is completely gone now, would have been a death trap. Maya felt a sudden tightness in her throat. I'm glad you're all safe. It's more than that, the woman continued. The way you people handled everything, it wasn't like other disasters we've seen on the news. It felt like someone was actually thinking about us as people, not just following some rulebook. The simple observation struck Maya profoundly. That was exactly what had changed in her own approach, seeing beyond protocols to the people. Those protocols were meant to serve. As she continued through the devastated neighborhood, Maya observed dozens of examples of this human-centered recovery. Already underway, a local construction company had brought heavy equipment to clear residential streets without waiting for city authorization. A neighborhood association had established an impromptu child care center so parents could begin cleanup work. A property management company had opened vacant apartments to displaced families without waiting for official emergency housing vouchers. None of these actions followed standard recovery protocols. All of them were making a genuine difference in people's lives. Back at the Emergency Management Center, Maya found Michael Torres coordinating volunteer deployment. His usual cynicism had been replaced by focused determination as he matched community volunteers with urgent neighborhood needs. Chun, he called when he spotted her. Perfect timing. I've got a situation that needs your particular brand of rule breaking. He explained that a local manufacturer had offered their warehouse as an emergency supply distribution center, a much-needed resource for neighborhoods with limited transportation access. But the facility didn't meet all the requirements for official designation, meaning they couldn't receive government-supplied relief materials. By the book, we should refuse the offer and stick with the designated distribution points, Torres said. But those points are inaccessible to about 30% of affected residents. 6 months ago, Maya would have instantly cited the regulations that prevented acceptance of the facility. 3 days ago, she might have looked for procedural workarounds while still trying to adhere to the rules. Today, she simply asked one question: does using this warehouse help more people get what they need? Torres nodded. Absolutely. It would bring supplies within walking distance for at least 3,000 residents. Then designated as a temporary auxiliary facility under the Emergency Powers Declaration, Maya decided. We'll conduct an expedited safety assessment to document basic compliance, but we're not turning away help because of paperwork. Torres grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. He handed her a tablet showing a growing list of similar situations, community resources, volunteer initiatives, and private sector assistance that didn't fit neatly into standard protocols, but offered vital support for recovery efforts. We've been maintaining this unofficial resource list, he explained. Things that don't meet all the regulatory requirements, but are actually helping people. I've been making judgment calls on what to authorize, but I could use some backup from someone with your newfound reputation for productive rule-breaking. Maya reviewed the list, impressed by the creativity and resourcefulness on display. A retired nurse had converted her undamaged home into a neighborhood first aid station. A network of amateur radio operators was providing communication services in areas without phone service. A restaurant association had created a mobile food distribution system using private vehicles. Authorize them all, she said without hesitation. Document what they're doing and provide whatever support we can. These people aren't waiting for official solutions, they're creating their own. Torres raised an eyebrow. Just like that? No checking regulations or consulting procedural guidelines. I'm applying a different standard now, Maya replied. Does it help people? Does it cause harm? If the answer is yes to the first and no to the second, then we support it, regardless of whether it follows every protocol. As they worked through the list, Maya realized how profoundly her perspective had shifted. The rules and protocols she had once seen as sacrosanct now appeared as tools useful in many circumstances. but not inherently valuable in themselves. What mattered was their purpose: protecting people, alleviating suffering, facilitating recovery. Throughout the day, she authorized dozens of unconventional initiatives, provided emergency resources to community-led efforts, and connected unofficial volunteer groups with official response teams. Each decision required evaluating purpose over procedure, outcome over process, human needs over regulatory compliance. By evening, this integrated approach was showing remarkable results. Recovery efforts that would normally take weeks were happening in days. Resources that would typically be bottlenecked by distribution regulations were reaching people through multiple channels. Communities that would traditionally wait passively for official assistance were actively participating in their own recovery. As Maya finally returned to her desk after 18 hours of continuous duty, she found a handwritten note from Director Blackwell. "Get some rest. That's an order. But before you do, know this. What you've done here goes beyond breaking rules or following them. You've reminded us why we created those rules in the first place and shown us how to look beyond them when necessary. That lesson is worth more than any protocol manual." Maya folded the note carefully and placed it in her pocket. For years, she had defined herself by how perfectly she followed the rules, seeking validation through compliance, building her identity around being Protocol Chen. Now she had found a different kind of excellence, not in blindly following procedures or recklessly rejecting them, but in understanding their purpose deeply enough to know when they helped and when they hindered. As she finally allowed herself to rest, Maya knew that Westbrook's recovery was just beginning. The challenges ahead would require countless decisions, adaptations, and improvisations. But for the first time in her career, she faced those challenges, not as a rule follower or a rule breaker, but as something more valuable than either: someone who understood that the rules were meant to serve people, not the other way around. And that understanding would rebuild not just a city, but a more human approach to emergency management itself. 6 months after Hurricane Diana devastated Westbrook, the southern basin had transformed from a disaster zone into a vibrant mosaic of recovery and renewal. Construction crews worked alongside homeowners to rebuild houses with improved hurricane resistance. Community gardens flourished in vacant lots where damaged structures had been removed. Solar panels gleamed on rooftops, part of a distributed power network that hadn't existed before the storm. Maya Chen stood at the window of her new office in City Hall, observing the activity below. The disaster had changed more than just the city's infrastructure. It had transformed her career and identity as well. The nameplate on her door now read Jun, Director of Community Resilience, a position created specifically for her. Following her revolutionary approach to hurricane response and recovery, a knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Deputy Director Torres, a promotion he'd earned through his own adaptability during the crisis, entered with a stack of folders. "The final assessment reports are ready for your review," he said, placing them on her desk. Damage recovery at 82%, infrastructure improvements at 91%, community satisfaction with recovery efforts at 88%. Numbers like these are unheard of for post-disaster operations. Maya accepted the folders, but her attention remained on the community below rather than the statistics. "Numbers don't tell the whole story," she replied. "Look out there. What do you see?" Torres joined her at the window. Below, a neighborhood block party was underway in what had once been one of the hardest-hit areas. Residents shared food. Children played in a newly constructed playground, and volunteers planted trees along streets that had been underwater half a year earlier. "I see people who didn't wait for permission to rebuild their community," Torres observed. "They didn't just recover, they reinvented." "Exactly." Maya turned away from the window. "And that's what these reports can't quantify. We didn't just repair physical infrastructure, we transformed how this community thinks about resilience and self-determination." The transformation had begun during those critical days immediately following Hurricane Diana, when Maya's unconventional approach to emergency management had empowered community-led recovery initiatives. What started as necessary adaptations to disaster conditions had evolved into a new philosophy that now guided Westbrook's approach to community development. Speaking of transformation, Torres said, checking his watch, the emergency management review board meeting starts in 30 minutes. You ready for this? Maya nodded, gathering her presentation materials. 6 months ago, the thought of presenting to the state's highest emergency management authority would have filled her with anxiety about perfect protocol adherence. Today, she approached it as an opportunity to challenge outdated thinking and champion a more human-centered approach. The review board meeting took place in the same conference room where Maya had once proposed her grid-by-grid recovery strategy. Today, the room was filled with state officials, emergency management experts, and representatives from other municipalities, all gathered to evaluate Westbrook's unprecedented disaster response. Board Chairman Wilson Gates, a 30-year veteran of emergency management, opened the proceedings with typical bureaucratic formality. This review will assess Westbrook's response to Hurricane Diana against established standards and protocols as outlined in the State Emergency Management Framework. Maya exchanged glances with Director Blackwell, who sat beside her. They both knew that Westbrook's response had deviated significantly from those established standards, and that those deviations had saved countless lives and accelerated recovery beyond all expectations. We'll begin with an overview of the initial response, Gates continued. I understand there were some unconventional decisions made regarding evacuation procedures. The way he emphasized unconventional made it sound like a polite substitute for inappropriate or unauthorized. Maya recognized the tone. It was the voice of institutional resistance, of rigid adherence to established norms regardless of their effectiveness. Director Blackwell began to respond, but Maya gently touched his arm. This was her story to tell. Chairman Gates, she said, standing to address the board, I was responsible for the evacuation decision you're referring to. And yes, it was unconventional by traditional standards. I issued an evacuation order for the Southern Basin without waiting for proper authorization through command chains. A murmur ran through the assembled officials. Such a direct acknowledgement of protocol violation was rarely heard in these proceedings. And why did you feel justified in bypassing established procedures? Gates asked, his tone carefully neutral. Maya activated the presentation screen, displaying the weather data she had analyzed that fateful day. Because the data indicated an imminent southward shift in the hurricane's path that would bring catastrophic conditions to an unprepared area. Following standard authorization procedures would have delayed evacuation by hours those residents didn't have. She advanced through the slides, showing the progression of Hurricane Diana exactly as she had predicted. My decision wasn't about rejecting protocols. It was about understanding what those protocols were designed to accomplish, protecting people and recognizing when adherence to process would undermine that very purpose. Chairman Gates leaned forward. Are you suggesting that emergency management professionals should simply ignore procedures whenever they personally deem it appropriate? Not at all, Maya replied calmly. I'm suggesting something much more difficult, that we must understand our procedures deeply enough to recognize when they serve their intended purpose and when they don't. Blind adherence is as dangerous as blind rejection. For the next hour, Maya walked the board through Westbrook's response to Hurricane Diana, not just the evacuation decision, but the hospital power solution, the unconventional recovery strategy, and the integration of community-led initiatives that had accelerated rebuilding beyond all precedent. Throughout her presentation, she emphasized a consistent philosophy. Protocols were tools, not commandments. Their value lay in their effectiveness, not their authority. And sometimes, serving the spirit of those protocols required departing from their letter. What you're describing sounds dangerously subjective, noted board member Eleanor Ramirez. If everyone in emergency management started making independent judgments about which rules to follow, we'd have chaos. With respect, board member Ramirez, Maya responded, what I'm describing isn't subjective at all. It's actually holding ourselves to a higher standard, not just asking, did I follow the procedure? But did my actions achieve the procedure's intended purpose? She displayed a slide comparing outcomes between standard protocol implementation and Westbrook's adaptive approach. The differences were stark, from evacuation success rates to recovery timelines to community satisfaction metrics. These results weren't achieved by abandoning procedures, Maya explained. They were achieved by understanding the purpose behind those procedures so deeply that we could adapt them to unprecedented circumstances. As her presentation concluded, the room fell into a contemplative silence. Maya had presented a fundamental challenge to decades of emergency management doctrine, not by rejecting it, but by calling for a deeper, more purposeful engagement with it. Chairman Gates finally broke the silence. Ms. Chen, your results are undeniable. But your approach raises serious questions about accountability, consistency, and the role of established protocols in emergency operations. Those are exactly the questions we should be asking, Maya agreed. Not to undermine protocols, but to strengthen them by ensuring they remain connected to their core purpose: saving lives and serving communities. The formal review continued with technical questions about specific decisions and their outcomes. Throughout the discussion, Maya maintained her central argument that Westbrook's success came not from rejecting rules, but from understanding them deeply enough to adapt them when necessary. As the meeting adjourned, Chairman Gates approached Maya privately. That was quite a performance, Ms. Chen. You've given this board a lot to think about. It wasn't a performance, sir, Maya replied. It was an honest assessment of what we learned through crisis. Gates studied her with newfound curiosity. You know, I've been in emergency management for 3 decades. I've seen every approach imaginable, from rigid rule followers to cowboys who think procedures are mere suggestions. But I've never encountered someone who respects protocols enough to know exactly when they should be broken. I don't think of it as breaking them, Maya said. I think of it as fulfilling their deeper purpose, even when that requires departing from their exact form. An interesting distinction. Gates handed her his card. The State Emergency Management Agency is revising its core protocols next month. We could use a perspective like yours on the committee. As Maya left the review board meeting, she found Mayor Ramirez waiting in the hallway. How did it go? The mayor asked. Better than expected, Maya replied. They actually listened, even if they didn't all agree. Mayor Ramirez smiled. Change doesn't happen all at once, but making them listen is the first step. She gestured toward the exit. Walk with me. There's something I want to show you. They drove through the rebuilt neighborhoods of Westbrook's southern basin, where recovery efforts continued at remarkable speed. What struck Maya most wasn't just the physical rebuilding, but the visible signs of community transformation. Neighbors who had once barely known each other now collaborated on shared projects. Public spaces that had been neglected before the hurricane were now vibrant gathering places. Innovations born of necessity during the crisis had evolved into permanent improvements. The mayor parked near a community center that had served as an emergency shelter during the hurricane. Today, it was hosting a neighborhood planning session, with residents gathered around tables covered in maps and design concepts. This is what I wanted you to see, Mayor Ramirez said as they entered. This isn't just recovery, it's reinvention. Inside, Maya was surprised to find residents debating not just how to rebuild what had been lost, but how to create something better. A group of homeowners discussed a shared solar microgrid that would make their block energy independent during future emergencies. Teachers planned a curriculum on community resilience for the local school. Small business owners collaborated on a mutual support network to weather future crises. What amazed Maya most was that none of this had been initiated by the city government. The residents themselves were driving these innovations, applying the lessons of self-determination they had learned during the hurricane recovery. An elderly woman recognized Maya and approached with a warm smile. "There she is, the woman who broke the rules and saved our neighborhood." Maya felt a flush of embarrassment. "I just did what needed to be done." "That's exactly right," the woman agreed. "And you showed us we could do the same. That's why we're here today, because you taught us that sometimes the most important protocols are the ones we create ourselves when the old ones don't serve anymore." As they toured the community center, Mayor Ramirez explained how Maya's approach during the crisis had sparked a broader transformation in how Westbrook citizens viewed their role in community resilience. Before Diana, people expected the government to handle emergencies according to established procedures, the mayor said. They might complain about those procedures, but they rarely questioned them or proposed alternatives. Now they're active participants in creating our resilience strategies. The mayor gestured toward a wall covered with community-generated emergency plans. These aren't just suggestions, they're legitimate innovations that we're incorporating into official protocols. Your willingness to adapt procedures to human needs showed everyone that the system could be both structured and flexible. 4. Maya, who had spent most of her career seeking validation through perfect procedural adherence, this new form of impact was profoundly meaningful. She hadn't just bent rules during a crisis, she had helped transform how an entire community thought about rules, systems, and their own agency within those systems. Later that afternoon, Maya returned to the Emergency Management Center for a training session with new coordinators. The facility had been redesigned following the hurricane, with more collaborative spaces and fewer hierarchical barriers. The changes reflected the philosophical shift that Maya had championed from rigid command structures to adaptive response networks. The training room was filled with fresh faces, emergency management specialists recruited following Hurricane Diana. Many had chosen this career path after witnessing Westbrook's innovative response to the disaster. "Welcome to your first day of emergency management training," Maya began. "You're probably expecting me to start by handing out procedure manuals and protocol guidelines." She paused, noting their surprised expressions when she didn't reach for the stack of binders beside her. "Instead, I'm going to start with a question. Why do these protocols exist in the first place?" The room fell silent as the new recruits considered this unexpected opening. "To standardize emergency response," offered one young woman tentatively. "To ensure proper procedures are followed," suggested another. Maya nodded. "Those are common answers. But they're actually secondary purposes. The primary purpose of every protocol in emergency management is simpler: to save lives and alleviate suffering." She walked to the whiteboard and wrote this fundamental purpose in large letters. Everything else, standardization, accountability, resource allocation, chain of command, these are all means to that end, not ends in themselves. And that distinction will be the foundation of your training here in Westbrook. For the next hour, Maya outlined a new approach to emergency management training, one that emphasized understanding the purpose behind protocols rather than merely memorizing their requirements. She shared real examples from Hurricane Diana, explaining how adherence to standard procedures would have caused harm in certain situations, while adaptive implementation saved lives. "You will learn every protocol in the book," she assured them. "You'll know them better than coordinators anywhere else in the country. But you'll learn them differently, not just as procedures to follow, but as tools designed for specific purposes. And you'll learn how to recognize when those tools are helping accomplish their purpose and when they're hindering it." A hand raised from the back of the room. "But how do we know when it's appropriate to adapt a protocol versus when we should follow it exactly?" That's the most important question you could ask, Maya replied with approval. And answering it requires more than just procedural knowledge. It requires context awareness, critical thinking, and a deep understanding of what each protocol was designed to accomplish. She shared the framework she had developed following Hurricane Diana, a decision matrix that helped coordinators evaluate when standard procedures served their intended purpose and when adaptation was necessary. The approach wasn't about replacing protocols, but about implementing them more purposefully. In traditional emergency management, Maya explained, success is measured by how perfectly you follow established procedures. In Westbrook's approach, success is measured by how effectively you achieve the human outcomes those procedures were designed to serve. As the training session concluded, one of the new coordinators approached Maya privately. I chose emergency management because I wanted clear guidelines for helping people during crisis, she admitted. Your approach sounds more challenging, requiring judgment calls rather than just following established rules. It is more challenging, Maya acknowledged. It's much easier to simply follow procedures than to constantly evaluate whether they're serving their purpose. But crisis doesn't respect our desire for simplicity. Real emergency management happens in the gap between what the protocols anticipate and what reality delivers. The coordinator considered this. So we need to be both rule followers and rule breakers? Neither, actually, Maya replied. We need to be purpose servers. Sometimes that means following rules exactly. Sometimes it means adapting them creatively. The consistency isn't in our actions, but in our commitment to the fundamental purpose behind all these protocols protecting people. That evening, as Maya prepared to leave the office, Director Blackwell stopped by with news. The State Emergency Management Agency just released their formal review of our hurricane response, he said, placing the report on her desk. I thought you'd want to see it right away. Maya opened the document with curiosity. For months, state officials had been evaluating Westbrook's unconventional approach to Hurricane Diana, analyzing data, interviewing personnel, and comparing outcomes to standard protocol implementations in previous disasters. The executive summary began with formal acknowledgement of protocol deviations, noted multiple instances where established procedures had been modified or bypassed, and listed the specific regulations that had not been strictly followed. But then the report took an unexpected turn. Despite or perhaps because of these departures from established protocols, Westbrook achieved unprecedented success in protecting life, facilitating recovery, and building community resilience. The purpose-centered approach implemented during Hurricane Diana resulted in 0 casualties, accelerated recovery timelines, and community satisfaction metrics that exceed all previously recorded disaster responses. This review recommends that state emergency management protocols be revised to incorporate Westbrook's adaptive implementation framework, emphasizing purpose fulfillment over procedural adherence in crisis response evaluation. Maya read the passage twice, hardly believing what she was seeing. The same institutional structure that had created the rigid protocols she once followed without question was now recommending her adaptive approach as a new standard. Congratulations, Blackwell said with genuine pride. You didn't just change Westbrook's approach to emergency management, you're changing how the entire state thinks about disaster response. Maya closed the report, feeling a profound sense of validation that went beyond any she had experienced in her career. She had always sought recognition through perfect compliance with established standards. Now she had found it by challenging those standards to better serve their fundamental purpose. There's more, Blackwell continued. The governor's office called today. They're establishing a special commission to redesign the state's emergency management framework based on lessons from Hurricane Diana. They want you to lead it. The offer represented an extraordinary opportunity to institutionalize the purpose-centered approach Maya had developed through crisis. It wasn't just about changing procedures, it was about transforming how emergency management systems balance structure and adaptability, rules and purpose, protocol, and humanity. What do you think? Blackwell asked when Maya remained silent. She thought about her journey from Protocol Chun, the perfect rule follower, to the coordinator who had broken the rules to save her city. But she realized now that neither identity fully captured the transformation she had undergone. She hadn't simply moved from following rules to breaking them. She had discovered a deeper consistency that transcended both a commitment to the human purpose behind every protocol. I think, Maya said finally, that this is just the beginning of a much longer conversation about what emergency management is really for, and how we build systems that truly serve people rather than just regulate them. As she looked out at the rebuilt southern basin of Westbrook, a community transformed not just physically but philosophically by crisis and response, Maya knew that the most important protocols weren't written in emergency management handbooks. They were written in the human commitment to care for one another, adapt to changing circumstances, and find purpose beyond procedure. The city had been saved not by perfect adherence to established rules, but by the courage to see beyond them. When necessary, to recognize that sometimes serving people meant questioning the very systems designed to protect them. And that was a lesson worth building a new framework upon. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe. And turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.